Well, welcome everyone. It's a bright sunny afternoon here in New Jersey. So thank you all for joining us for this rescheduled talk. This is sponsored by the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University. And I'm delighted to welcome back Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen, who is joining us from Israel. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with us today. Our talk this afternoon is part 2 of a mini course on Jewish farming in New Jersey. And we are just thrilled that you're able to join us and we're able to continue this. A big announcement that I wanted to make is that the digital exhibit website, which is where this project started last year, has been updated just this week with a community contributions page. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that and see a sample of it. So we're really delighted that so many people out in the community were interested in our project, got involved with the project, and contributed their memories and their stories. So I'd like to bring on Jonathan Dekel-Chen. Let me just see if I can give him the...
Okay, thank you, Karen. Welcome everyone. It's evening now in the Western Negev where I live, but I'd like to welcome you all back with my apologies for the long postponement in this second session. And I realize that there's a certain lack of continuity, but let there be no doubt, this was all my doing because of a family health issue had to postpone. So for those of you who have come back, welcome. And now, as Karen said, a big development in this project that has occurred since we last met was the community contributions page. Gabe, if you would put that up, please. You might remember at the end of our last meeting, way back in February, I appealed to the community to contribute materials about their family histories or other materials that they did have about Jewish farming life. And Gabe, are you going to show us that page? And over the course of the last 2.5, 3 months, my graduate assistant, Jackie Hankard, and I worked on creating and curating this page. And Karen, can you see the page? I cannot.
Karen's muted, but if you could.
Yes, I don't see the very top. Maybe Gabe, just go back up so everyone sees the top of the exhibit, a little bit higher for Rutgers, Jewish Agriculturalism in the Garden State. This is the digital exhibit available on Rutgers website. You can find it at the Bildner Center. And now you'll see the community contributions page. This tab is the new page that's been added. Jonathan, you don't see it?
Can I get
from the audience, can you let us know? Do you see this page? Yes, I see some head shaking. Yes, terrific. Okay.
All right.
So scroll down and we'll see the names of the people who contributed. And then you can click on, why don't we just click on the first one, Lior. And then scroll down a bit. And here you can see Lior's story and some photos that were submitted from the 60s. These are all circa 1967 from their family egg farm. Here are the cows. Spring planting, a variety of photos. And this, I think this is amazing, this aerial view of the farm taken in 1940. That's just terrific. So this is just a sample of one of the pages and the different stories you can visit and learn more about the history of Jewish farming in New Jersey.
Okay, and thank you all for those of you who contributed materials. It will be up to the Bildner Center in the future to decide if there'll be another round of this crowdsourcing. In any case, I think it's very exciting. We heard your voices and we're thrilled to receive these materials and got to know a few more corners of this very, very rich and wide story. And from here, Gabe, could you put up now the presentation itself?
It is now live.
Okay, and Jonathan, excuse me for 1 second. I just want to mention to everyone, we will be taking questions through the chat. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Professor Decohen, please type it in the chat, and at the end of his presentation, I'll be moderating those questions and I'll pose those to him. So please feel free to write your question in the chat during the program.
Okay, unfortunately, I am not able to see through some miracle or problem with technology. I cannot see my own presentation right now, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to make do as things are. For those of you who were with us when we last met, the first class dealt with the very wide world and history of Jewish farming. And I wanted, before we move forward, to kind of review some of the basic concepts that came up from that history. And the first illustration of it really is on this opening slide, where we see a Jewish farm, a highly advanced Jewish farm with tractors and plows and so on in the middle of the 1920s, but not in the United States, where some of you may have been more familiar with that past, but rather in Soviet Russia. It was one of the many, many projects that we talked about back in February. But there are some constants that are constants not only in Jewish farming on the other three continents, but rather also that will extend into the United States all the way to New Jersey. So the first of those really was colonists, Jewish farmers, who came from other places. They resettled onto farms. And in the case of that slide that we see, from war-devastated areas of Soviet Russia. And of course, as many of you know, a lot of the colonists who eventually came to New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Colorado, what have you, were from very, very similar places. The second common element was the technological element. You see here a tractor or tractors at a time when they were fairly rare in farming anywhere in the world. And that became also a kind of cornerstone of Jewish farming everywhere. A third cornerstone is this idea of aid, aid coming to these farmers from Jewish philanthropic organizations. In the case of the slide we have in front of us, that was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, but there were many more, and we'll touch upon them in the US scenario in a little while. And finally, a kind of accommodation with local neighbors. While it's true that whether we're talking about North America or the Soviet Union or many other places around the globe, that the local authorities were resettling Jews there for, at times, what might be considered a kind of colonialism. But the Jews themselves, those Jewish resettlers to farming colonies, communities, by and large, actually got along quite well with their local indigenous neighbors once they got there. And in fact, agricultural resettlement wound up rescuing hundreds of thousands of Jews from desperate situations, all of them in Europe, and empowering them in new surroundings. And this is also part of the New Jersey story. How do they do that? Well, first, there's faith throughout the Jewish world that extended from Paris all the way to Alliance, New Jersey, for example, and the restorative power of going back to the land. Secondly, we're very generous and forward-thinking funders. The name de Hirsch comes up a lot in the American context, but he wasn't alone in this. Also, cooperative organizations, and we touched upon it back in February, and we'll touch upon it again because it's really important in this story. And finally, a willingness to embrace by these farmers, most of whom knew nothing about farming before they arrived in the colonies, whether or not that was in Crimea or in Roosevelt, New Jersey, their willingness to embrace modern agro-technologies and marketing methods. These are all secrets to what would become, for the most part, success stories. So these are the bones of what made, these are the bones that are both local and international for understanding the body of what will happen in Jewish farming in the United States. So as promised, today I'm going to try in the time that we have to guide us through a historical kind of tour of Jewish farming in the United States. As we move through time and space, I suggest that you think about the building blocks of Jewish agriculture around the world that we encountered back in February in our first class. And we'll spend most of our time today in New Jersey, but even then, I have to apologize in advance to those of you who might be disappointed that I won't mention today one or another of the colonies in New Jersey, particularly in central Jersey. But rest assured, the digital exhibit and the community contribution do devote attention to them. Next slide, please. What we see here is really the beginning of modern Jewish farming in North America. In the context of a utopian movement that began in the 1880s in Russia, in Imperial Russia, in response to pogroms and other pressures against East European Jews. And there was two small movements, one called Am Olam in the more correct Hebrew, the other called Chovavei Tzion, Am Olam meaning people of the world, and Chovavei Tzion, the lovers of Zion. The first group wound up migrating from the Russian Empire to a couple dozen Jewish communes, utopian communes that they created in the United States, in North America. The second group, coming from pretty much the same cities in the Russian Empire, Kiev, Odessa, Vilna, set up very similar utopian farming communes in Palestine at the time. Again, we're talking about the 1880s. In the photos, we see New Odessa, Oregon, as testament to the place that they came from, and the other in Cotopaxi, Colorado. Some of the other approximately 24 Am Olam communes settled in really unlikely places, most of which you probably have never heard of, like the Palestine colony in Bad Axe, Michigan, or Sicily Island in Louisiana. Closer to our home in Rutgers, two of these Am Olam colonies were created in southern New Jersey, very close to each other, Alliance and Carmel. We'll discuss them in a little while. Next slide, please, Gabe. This map ushers us eastward to Connecticut and the second, much more successful phase of Jewish agricultural settlement that began in the 1890s. All of those first Am Olam colonies in the 1880s failed miserably. And except for Alliance, they were entirely abandoned by the initial communards, and they dispersed to all sorts of places in the United States, usually into cities that weren't too far from the place that those communes arose. This second phase that begins in the 1890s, the single biggest difference between them is the entrance into this picture of generous funders. Among them, of course, the Baron de Hirsch that some of you are familiar with, but there were many others, and we'll touch upon them in a little bit. Starting from the 1890s, these colonies were no longer dispersed, or the colonies that arose from the 1890s were no longer dispersed all over the United States and Canada. Rather, they were concentrated in clusters in several different places, mainly in the Northeast of the United States and in Saskatchewan, in Canada, and in Quebec. They all were to focus on dairy farming, tobacco, and potatoes. That would have been the profile in New Jersey, in the Northeast of the United States and in Canada, while in New Jersey, vegetables and orchards were the norm, at least for the first few decades, starting in the 1890s. Eventually, almost all of the farms in the United States shifted towards poultry, as it became clear that that was sort of the biggest bang for the buck, and by far the least capital intensive crop that there was. To compensate for the uncertainties of seasonal income, which is always a problem with agriculture, colonies all over the Northeast began offering vacation bungalows to Jews from the cities and experimented with small-scale industries. In the digital exhibit, we go into depth around this, and some of you might know or be surprised to hear that the beginnings of what eventually became the Borscht Belt and the Catskills actually began decades earlier, around the turn of the 20th century, in these same kind of summer cottages, vacation cottages in New Jersey, but especially in New York and in Connecticut, at a time when Jews from the city were not allowed to attend or be a part of non-Jewish country clubs. These Jewish farms offer them a way to spend time in the country and to get out of the city. Let's zero in for a moment on this map of Connecticut to a town called Colchester, which you can see it's in the center of the map. It's marked in red. I have a small story about Colchester. As you can hear from my voice, I didn't grow up in Israel. I grew up actually in Connecticut, in a small town called Bloomfield, which we will also mention later. It has a farming history. But growing up in the 60s and the 70s, I had heard sort of these rumors or these stories told at synagogue, at the Jewish Center and so on, about what was supposedly like a Jewish chicken farming empire in Colchester, Connecticut, which was maybe 15 miles from where I grew up. By the 60s or the 70s, this sounded to me to be a total myth. It couldn't be true. How could Jews be farmers and certainly poultry farmers anywhere near where I live? Well, decades went by until I started studying this, and it turns out actually that Colchester was a Jewish chicken farming empire that devolved by the time I came into the picture in the 60s and the 70s. Again, this is captured in more detail for those of you who are interested in the digital exhibit. Gabe, next slide, please. I was speaking about Bloomfield, and here we have a great picture of that. In Bloomfield specifically, there was tobacco, Jewish tobacco farms, but also cattle raising. And why cattle raising? Well, it turned out that in Hartford, and we're talking about the first half of the 20th century, in Hartford, in the greater Hartford area, there was actually quite a large Jewish population that needed kosher meat. And so Kalman Berkowitz, who was a recent arrival from Germany, actually, who had a history of cattle farming in Germany, became a kind of cattle growing and slaughtering baron in the area. And eventually, Kalman and his son founded what was sort of the central supermarket, or one of the first supermarkets in the whole area, based initially on this cattle farm. So as we see, there's a kind of proliferation that has many different faces in the area. Next slide, please, Gabe. Another picture that has a personal connection to me from Connecticut. In this slide, and again, I apologize, I can't actually see the slide right now, but you can see from the caption that there are a number of people in that slide. The one that I'm most interested in addition to the governor of Connecticut or the lieutenant governor and his wife, I believe are in the slide, is Bob Goldman, who was the state agronomist of Connecticut for decades. He himself was the son of colonies, Jewish colonies, not in Connecticut, but rather in upstate New York. He studied, after growing up on one of these farms in the Catskills, he studied agronomy at Cornell, as many of the sons and daughters of these colonies did by the mid to late 1940s. Probably as a result of the GI Bill, which was really critical. I'll come back to that in a little while. What's my connection? It turns out that this same Bob Goldman, I knew very well in my childhood. He was a family friend and a husband of my beloved kindergarten teacher. So I was surrounded by all of this growing up in the Northeast, but knew very little about it. I discovered that he was the state agronomist in Connecticut about 5 years ago while researching the Jewish farming past in the Greater Hartford Jewish Federation archives. Until then, I had no clue. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's time to dive into New Jersey. Some of you may recognize points on this map of southern New Jersey, where the story of Jewish farming in the United States took root in Alliance in 1882, which is marked here by a red arrow. As I mentioned before, Alliance, unlike the rest of the colonies in this map, began its long journey beforehand as one of the failed utopian Am Olam communes I had mentioned earlier. Like all of them, it failed miserably in its first years. But unlike the rest, it survived and reconstituted itself as a more conventional agricultural community, together with a kind of core group of the original communards, one of whom will be meeting very shortly. While we're looking at this map, I'd like you to note the town of Vineland. Vineland is a town, it's not a colony, with the blue arrow, and the Woodbine colony further south, marked by the yellow arrow. We'll refer back to both of them shortly. I'm imagining that for most of you, these two names are a little bit more well known. Next slide, please, Gabe. We see here a typical scene in Alliance around the turn of the 20th century. Next slide, please, Gabe. What we see here is a household map of the Alliance colony with its kind of suburbs of Norma and Brotmanville that came about, or this map was drawn, not very long ago, through the dedication of a small group of descendants of these colonies, led by Jay Greenblatt and others, who was gracious enough to provide me with a copy of it. Jay Greenblatt was a descendant of Jacob, who we saw in the previous photo from Alliance. As happened in many of the colonies, Alliance became a kind of hub around which additional colonies arose. So Alliance began, and then Norma and Brotmanville sprang up around it. Brotmanville specifically, a fascinating story, as a kind of industrial suburb of Alliance, as it became clear that this was going to become a center of Jewish life, but that farming alone was not going to be able to sustain this community totally on its own, and hence Brotmanville, named after the owner of the original factory, who brought the next wave of colonists and resettled from New York with factories, with textile factories, to this land adjacent to Alliance. So what happens? Generations of refugees or immigrants, depending on how you prefer to look at it, just off the boat from Eastern Europe, starting in the 1880s, and others who had endured for a while hardships in the tenements along the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Newark. They built lives in Alliance and colonies around the United States. Colonies like Alliance allowed them to enter American society with less of the stress and trauma than in the big cities. And as a result, over time, with a lot of ups and downs, tens of thousands of relatively new arrivals from Eastern and later Central Europe will create a foothold in the United States, not in sort of the legendary tenement culture that we're perhaps most familiar with, or most American Jews are familiar with, but rather in farms in the Northeast and in the West Coast, and here and there in other parts of the United States. Next slide, please, Gabe. Up to now, we've spoken about Jewish farmers, their life on the farm, how they got there, when they got there. But what about the fate of Judaism on the farm? Everywhere else in the world, we touched upon this back in February, everywhere else in the world, the fate of the Jewish religion, Judaism, around the same time, first half of the 20th century, was actually rather positive. Because of its isolated nature, colonies by and large tended to preserve Judaism, ritual Judaism, a bit better than back in the big cities, where the forces of assimilation or acculturation tended to be much more intense. And as a result, there was an abundance of synagogues built in New Jersey and other locations. In fact, my father served as a cantor for the holidays. We grew up in Bloomfield, where there were no farms, but in the 1950s, he moonlighted in Jewish farms as a cantor, Jewish farms in Columbia, Connecticut, which again, I had never heard of until he told me this story, to supplement his income as a tailor, more or less, in Hartford. So there were and many dozens of these farming synagogues throughout the United States, some of which actually continue to function. A small number of them continue to function. What we see here also is a street sign on this slide, a street sign at the corner of Schiff and Gershel Street in Alliance, just in front of the synagogue that we see. Although very, very few Jews still live in the area, and not just in Alliance, the original street signs remain, which I found rather remarkable, bearing the name of wealthy benefactors of the Alliance colony, Jacob Schiff and I believe Hirsch Gershel, both of whom, well, Schiff much more than Gershel, contributed some of the seed funds for that regeneration of Alliance in the 1890s and into the 20th century. The same is true, by the way, in Woodbine. Many of the original names of those streets, including the sort of the main road into Woodbine from the highway, are named after original Jewish benefactors. That main drag is called De Hirsch Avenue. Next slide, please. As you may have already guessed, the children in many colonies in the Jewish world wound up seeking futures away from the farm. Being a scholar of Jewish agriculture in the modern world, almost everywhere, I think what I can say with confidence is that there is the dilemma of mostly the third, sometimes even the second generation. What does that mean? Whether we're talking about a kibbutz in the Negev, where I live, or a farm in New Jersey, the original settlers, if they remain, and some of them do not, they leave very quickly, but assuming that they do remain on the land, their children very often remain on the land, sort of inherit that farm, whether it's more or less collective, but those children, meaning the grandchildren of the original settlers, almost never stay. It's a phenomenon that I cannot explain sociologically, but it's really a rule of thumb. And the same held true for a variety of reasons that we'll touch upon in the colonies in the United States. And this slide also illustrates for us what was really a very early trajectory, outward trajectory, in this case, from Alliance. What we see here is provided to me by William Levin, who is a descendant of Moses Bayuk, we see in the slide, I believe a great-grandchild of Moses Bayuk. Bayuk's sons, or at least some of them, departed the colony very early on and decided to set up a cigar factory, evidently based on knowledge that they had gathered while still in Alliance, and became, from what I understand, rather wealthy cigar makers or prominent cigar makers. That factory continued to operate well into the 20th century. The children and grandchildren of these farms took their places more often than not in cities and towns adjacent to the colonies themselves in white-collar professions of one kind or another. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, university instructors, physicists, you name it. Next slide, please, Gabe. Now we'll look at another map of the colonies in southern New Jersey. As we've heard, Alliance originally served as a kind of hub for Jewish settlement. But within a radius of just a couple of miles, other colonies were founded in Carmel, Six Points, Garten Road, Rosenheim. All of these were products of that second stage of settlement, starting in the 1890s until after the First World War. Over time, both connected and unconnected to the Jewish farms, the town of Vineland, marked here with the blue arrow, became a kind of meeting ground for all of these colonies. We're talking about thousands of them, and as a market town, a point for shipping elsewhere, and a place where the sons and daughters of colonies very often chose to make a new life as white-collar professionals. And to this day, many descendants of these colonies in the area actually bring up Vineland as the place that they were located. I'm still not sure that that was really the case. I think for the most part, people were in these colonies, some of which I mentioned, but wound up spending quite a lot of time in Vineland, both for education, for culture, for social meetings, but most importantly, as a central market and for marketing their goods, for the most part, cooperatively, but also privately. Next slide, please. The network of colonies around Vineland, along with other colonies in New Jersey, upstate New York, Connecticut, and California, had a crucial role as a refuge for Jews fleeing fascist Europe before the Second World War and for Holocaust survivors after them. From testimonies that I've heard and from some of the historical documents that I gathered, they were not only a welcomed additions to these farms, but in a way, they also were a source of kind of longevity or oxygen, because by the 30s, that third generation dilemma had already begun to take hold in some of the older colonies, meaning that they were becoming depopulated from by way of the younger people leaving and seeking out their futures elsewhere. When these many thousands, again, first refugees from Nazi Germany, for the most part, Nazi Germany and hyper-nationalist Poland before 1939, even into 1940, begin arriving here, sent there. They didn't come willy-nilly. Instead, they were sent to the colonies and provided for by the Jewish Agricultural Society, which was based in New York, and the De Hirsch Fund, also based in New York, to help give them that same kind of, we'll call it softer landing in the United States, in a new home, in a more caring community. They, in fact, brought up the demographics of these communities and probably gave them a lifespan of another 20 years. What we see here in this slide are two post-war refugees participating in poultry farming, which, as I mentioned, became really central to Jewish farming throughout the Northeast, starting in the 1930s. And not just because Jews preferred it, not necessarily, but because these regions in general became linchpins for the poultry industry throughout the United States at that time. And from the funder's point of view, there was an added benefit to poultry farming, especially when resettling these refugees, first before the war and then displaced persons after the war. Unlike almost every other farming branch, poultry farming, whether or not one was raising them for meat or for eggs, did not require a great deal of training, and whatever training was necessary could pretty much be done on the job through agricultural advisors, agronomists, that these same agencies sent to the farms on a weekly or monthly basis. So it was easily learned on the one hand without a lot of preparation, and it didn't require a lot of capital to set up a poultry farm. You needed some sheds, you needed to buy chicks or eggs, and you needed some feed. Beyond that, it was not very demanding on the farmers themselves. They didn't need to take out very large loans, which was part of the problem in the first generation of farmers. Also, unlike almost every other farming branch, the turnaround to actually start receiving cash was very quick. Within a matter of weeks, not months, certainly not years, within a matter of weeks, a poultry farmer could begin receiving income. It wouldn't necessarily pay all of the bills, but there was money coming into the farm from eggs or from meat within just a few weeks. So this is another reason that some people sometimes wonder, why so many chickens? Well, this is part of the answer, not just because of general trends, but also because it made absolute sense for the Jewish support agencies to be promoting this for these refugees or survivors. And next slide, please. Moving to the southern tip of New Jersey, Cape May County, we encounter another spoke in the history of Jewish farming. Here in Woodbine, New Jersey, we'll take a look at key contributing factors to the success of Jewish farming in the United States. First off, is the funding aspect. As we saw before in street signs, the Woodbine colony was a totally planned community, There was a very, very small town there before, but that same De Hirsch Fund that I mentioned before identified it because of its location. At the time, it was much more, in a way, much more centrally located in terms of its marketing power than it currently is today. So first, because of location, and also because of this idea that we saw from other places around the world of the absolute necessity of creating Jewish or vocational training in farming for these newly created Jewish farmers. And so Woodbine, in addition to the colony, to the planned colony that's established there, will become a really pivotal place in the Jewish farming story because of the school that was created there. Next slide, please. And what I hope you see here is the Baron de Hirsch Agricultural School in Woodbine that opened in the 1890s as a training facility for young Jews, both boys and girls, sons and daughters of the Jewish farm, or those that wanted to become Jewish farmers, to get a thorough education in all aspects of farming. It opens in 1894, if I recall correctly, and operates until 1917, churning out a full generation of Jewish farmers. That school, as I believe you can see on the slide, has had other owners since then, since 1917. But that by far is not that was not the end of the Jewish vocational training story, because after 1917, when that school disbanded, by the way, it disbanded, as sometimes happens in the Jewish world, because of internal arguments, not because it wasn't needed anymore. A new school was opened a couple of years later in Peekskill, New York, with the same director, Dr. Joseph Rosen, another Cornell-trained Jewish agronomist. And Peekskill operated for another decade and a half with the same kind of program, vocational training for young Jews. By the way, that training was provided for free in order to proactively create and sustain and strengthen professional Jewish farmers. Next slide, please. Given what we've already learned, it should be a surprise to you by now that agricultural training for young American Jewish farmers remained a priority into the 1940s, which is illustrated by this advertisement for what was the National Farm School. The full name, however, by the 1940s, of course, believe it or not, there was much more sensitivity about being Jewish. And this was, in fact, the Jewish National Farm School. But in the advertisement, the leaders of the farm school decided to delete that name. Since 1960, the Jewish National Farm School has been the home of the Delaware Valley College of Science and Agriculture. But during its lifespan of about 30 years, that college, the National Farm School, was one of the first of its kind. In fact, all of these are amongst the first of its kind, starting in, as we said, Woodbine, going to Peekskill, and eventually here to the National Farm School in Doylestown, where anyone could receive advanced vocational training in agriculture. It was almost unheard of at the time, certainly for high school age children. It was all three of them, by the way, lest I forget, they were boarding schools. So this was all about professionalizing as quickly as possible generations of young Jews. Next slide, please. Jewish colonists and the millions of other European Jews who arrived in the United States and Canada between the 1880s and World War II really did believe they'd arrived in the Golden Medina, in the Golden Land. They knew then and now, however, that life could be very hard in the immigrant, for the immigrant generation. I mean, that is the immigrant story, after all. In the colonies, Jewish colonies, child mortality was in fact painfully high in its first decades. And like in all of these projects around the world, these farmers were subject to nature's cruelty in the highs and lows of the farming economy. Here we see gravestones of very young children that really pepper the cemeteries, and there are many of them, cemeteries of these Jewish colonies. And they tell the story on their own of how difficult life could be there. Again, child mortality was true everywhere. High child mortality was true everywhere, certainly until the end of the First World War in the United States. But lest we have any illusions about the quality of life or the risks of being in a very outlying community, then these should make it painfully clear to us that not all was joyous in these farms as well. Next slide, please. American Jewish farmers shared those highs and lows with each other. Starting in the 1890s, there were a couple of different versions of this monthly newspaper, the Jewish Farmer, that was published consecutively well into the 1940s. But what we do see here is an interesting transition from Yiddish. It was gradual, didn't happen in one day, and from Yiddish to Hebrew in this newspaper, which was a national, it was distributed nationally to Jewish farmers in the that transition in the 1920s and the 1930s. It gives us an indication of how these farmers and their children were acclimating to life in their new homes in North America, as the usage of Yiddish declined and the prioritization of English became more and more obvious. And next slide, please. These next two slides are still lives of Jewish farming from the eastern United States to the West Coast from the 1940s and the 1960s. By the end of the Second World War, there were dozens of Jewish colonies spread over the Northeast all the way to California. By some estimates, around 150,000 American Jews actively farmed the land at this time. And Gabe, go to the next slide. It should be 55 to give us another few impressions.
We're there at 55.
Okay, thank you. And now you can move on to the next slide, 56. Reinforced by the arrival of hardworking Holocaust survivors, Jewish colonies everywhere in the United States experienced significant regrowth, regeneration in the decade or so after the Second World War, so from 1945 till 1955. This celebratory pamphlet attests to that, because almost all of the men and women in this cooperative association were themselves relatively recent immigrants, some of them Holocaust survivors, some of them refugees before the war, that created this poultry cooperative. But it also, this pamphlet points to something else, in a similarity between the American Jewish Project or the Canadian Jewish Project and its counterparts around the world. What things that we saw back in February, whether we're talking about Argentina or Eastern Europe. The centrality of cooperative organizations. These were both marketing organizations, which we see here, but that same cooperative society, much like they did elsewhere around the Jewish world, turned into purchasing cooperatives, but most importantly, perhaps, mutual aid cooperatives. They were the first of their kind everywhere that Jews settled in mass, creating these farming cooperatives, most of which, surprisingly, amazingly, continue to exist, although the Jewish farmers are long gone from these regions. Next slide, please. If there's anyone here who's attending from the West Coast, there's also this fascinating story of the Jewish colony in Petaluma, California, Northern California, just north of San Francisco, where chickens were king. The Petaluma colony, in some ways, shares some similarities with the Roosevelt colony or Jersey homesteads both of which are detailed or highlighted in the digital exhibit. In as much as they were, the colonists themselves were far more politically identified than in any other colonies. It would be very difficult in general to point to any political orientation of Jewish farming colonists anywhere in North America, except for these two, both in Petaluma and in Jersey Home, that becomes Roosevelt later on, are very much identified with the American labor movement and or the Jewish socialist movement in the United States, which is kind of apropos for today. It's May Day today. So if you do nothing else today, you might want to take a look at those pages on the digital exhibit. In any case, whereas in both cases actually, Roosevelt and Petaluma were successful for their time, but eventually, like almost all of the other colonies, began to lose vitality, moving into the late 1950s, and into the 1960s. Next slide, please. So, if this second stage, or maybe even third stage, post-World War II stage of Jewish colonies in North America, especially in New Jersey, they were so successful, why did they disappear? I mean, the places still exist, the synagogues still exist for the most part, the cemeteries are still there, many of the structures are still there, and here and there's even a museum. But Jewish colony farming life has been absent now for many decades and exists really only in memory. So why did that happen? Reading it sort of backwards, by the 1970s, there were really only still a handful of Jewish farms that still operated. And today, and we detail this again on the separate page in the digital exhibit, there are a number of new and fascinating attempts by mainly young Jews, mostly in the Northeast, but not just, trying to create a version of Jewish farming life. For the most part, it is not residential. Rather, these are farms, I can call them, I guess, day farms, or farms that are populated by young people, city people, during Jewish holidays, on weekends at times, or perhaps for summer, to, in a way, merge what is a emerging food culture in the United States, especially amongst younger generations, and a search for a new kind, or maybe an old kind, of Jewish identity linked directly to the land. But again, there's a big gap between the end of the mass farming movement, let's say, moving through the 1960s, and this very, very new generation. And we're talking about perhaps several hundred altogether in the United States of people who are associated with these new and interesting farms. So what happened in the meantime? Well, we talked about before this dilemma of the third generation, even second generation. That certainly plays a part, but there was an accelerating moment for all of this, for the vast majority of young people, sons and daughters of the farms in the United States, especially after 1945. And that was called, and that perhaps not negative, but unfortunate development was caused by a very positive thing, which was the GI Bill. For those of you who don't know, anyone who served honorably in the armies of the United States, men or women, during the Second World War, received, once they came home, the ability to get a free education at a public university. And the vast majority of young people from the Jewish farm served in the army, and the vast majority of them elected to take advantage of the GI Bill. Almost all of them did not want to go, once they had received their higher education, did not want to go back to being farmers. Some of them, for example, the agronomists, the trained agronomists like Bob Goldman that I spoke about earlier, were perfectly happy to continue servicing the Jewish farming economy, but they themselves did not want to go back to the farm as their parents had done. So this was a huge demographic accelerator, but that's not the only reason that these farms disappear. And the second reason is that Jewish farming life, or put differently, farming life in the United States, this image of being a farmer took a big hit through the 1940s and the 1950s. There was a time that even a Jewish mama would feel okay saying that their sons or their daughters were farmers. It was a certain point in time. That point was bridged somewhere around the Second World War, where it became a kind of shanda, kind of embarrassment to say or to think that your children were farmers. Rather, they were supposed to become doctors, lawyers, stockbrokers, you name it, just not farmers. So there's that psychological element as well. But perhaps most importantly, from the end of the Second World War, over the course of the next 20 years, it was an uphill battle at best to try to survive as a family farm in the United States. This was the beginning of the incorporation of farming throughout the United States, making it nearly impossible for family farms to survive. In the Jewish case, these cooperatives that I mentioned before actually elongated Jewish farming life probably beyond what it could have done without them, because there was a kind of economy of numbers in these cooperatives. But it almost wouldn't have mattered, I believe, in the long run. Whatever happened with the GI Bill, it would have been almost impossible for Jewish farming life to continue with any sort of vitality and substantially after the late 1950s, because it didn't survive anywhere in the United States substantially after the late 1950s. So with that, we conclude our journey into the history of modern Jewish farming. And of course, I'll take some questions later on if you have them. And this slide offers us a montage of Jewish farmers cutting across time and space from California. That's Sam Hamburg. I don't know if he's on the left or the right, but working he was actually a very prominent farmer in California with, as you can see, a large melon plantation. He also, this same Sam Hamburg, is actually little known in Israel as well. He helped just out of a sense of Zionist commitment. Although he remained in the United States for all of his life, he was instrumental in helping Israel develop its drip irrigation technology because he had experimented with it on his farms in California. But from Sam Hamburg, we go all the way to Palestine, Israel, where most of us, if we were asked, or certainly our children, when we asked them, where has there ever been strong Jewish farming in the modern period, would say, well, it's only really ever existed in Israel. But I hope as a result of, for those of you who weren't aware of it before, I hope as a result of this mini course, we can now have a different answer to that question. So here in one slide, we get a sense of the global history of Jewish farmers in the modern era. We certainly haven't been able to cover every place and every story in this modern history, but I do hope that you now have a basic picture of this mostly forgotten history. And so I invite anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into the stories we've talked about here and many others to visit that digital museum exhibit that you can access on the Bildner Center's website. I thank the Bildner Center for giving me the opportunity to create that digital exhibit. It really has been an awful lot of fun. At this point, our paths, I think, are going to be getting further away from one another. But I do believe that it can be an ongoing resource for the community, and certainly a place where more and more community contributions can arrive. And I hope that we've created something of an appetite for it moving forward. So thank you all. And now, Karen, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, I think, from the wider thank you of bringing this history to our attention and bringing it out to our community, and for the lasting exhibit that is now on the Bildner Center's website. And could that go in the chat, please? The how to get to the site, Gabriel? So
Yes, I will put it.
thank you. Just in case you haven't visited yet or don't know how to get there, the address is coming up in a second in the chat. And it's so interesting to hear about the modern young farmers who are returning to the land and returning to this idea. Could you talk a little bit more about what's happening in New Jersey with these young farmers?
Well, I don't know if they're online right now, but the one that I'm most familiar with is ACRE. So it's the Alliance Colony Reboot, which was undertaken some years ago by William and Malia Levin, who William is, as I mentioned, a direct descendant of one of the original founders of the Alliance Colony, Moses Bayou. And they have decided to, in a way, recreate the spirit of the time and have that farm, the original family farm, with the original house still standing, although it's in desperate need of repair, to recreate a kind of Jewish farming presence and spirituality on the farm. And so it is becoming, I think it's fair to say, a kind of regional resource, because you have around them in that area a number of different people who are still interested in preserving the memory of the farms, and also active Jewish farmers, a small handful of active Jewish farmers. William and Malia are also trying to actually re-farm the land in many ways with local partners. And there are some really interesting things going on there. And I'm hoping, I don't know if it actually has taken root yet, but while I was a fellow at Rutgers, we tried to create an internship program at the farm for students in the Rutgers Agricultural School. And I hope that that is also taking root. There are all sorts of opportunities. Now, in addition to that, there are other farms, and I use the term farm loosely, again, because the ones that I'm familiar with, and again, there are many, they are designed not to be residential farms or colonies, but rather local, by and large, younger Jews have rented or perhaps even purchased tracts of land for farming, for small market gardens usually, that of course provide vegetables, generally speaking, for the members of those local communities. But those farms are meant not just to provide sustenance, and those are things that exist all over, certainly in the Northeast, community farms like that, but also to be a kind of nexus for Jewish community building. And that, I think, is really becoming popular amongst younger Jews who are not finding or haven't found a anchor, a source of community and Jewish identity that really matches their needs in conventional places, be it synagogues, and Jewish community centers, that sort of thing. And the beauty of these projects is that out there on these tracks, you can create whatever community with whatever priorities you would like. So whether it's sort of alternative celebrations of Jewish holidays or revitalizing Yiddishkeit. There is a Yiddish farm, and I think actually more than one. And these are wonderful platforms to try and do that. And my impression is that there's a lot of commitment from these younger people, in terms of accessibility to older communities. That I'm less sure of. But for those of you who are interested in exploring this, as I mentioned, on the digital exhibit, we have created a page with links and short descriptions of many of them. And I invite, again, if the Bildner Center is willing, I invite anyone who has knowledge of other farms like this that are currently operational to let the Bildner Center know, and perhaps that can be added, those references, those links can be added to the website as well, to the exhibit as well.
Absolutely. If there's new information, please do let us know. And as these farms grow and things change, we'd love to be in touch with you. I think I do see that William Levin is on the program. Let us know, keep in touch, and let us know if the internship program progresses or if there's a way we can be helpful with that. Thank you so much. Jonathan, someone had asked if you could talk more about the Jewish dairy farmers, that it didn't really come up in your talk today.
Right. Well, look, dairy farming was definitely a huge source of income for Jewish farming for a time, but most importantly, regionally. Dairy farming was by far much more common. Jewish dairy farming was much more common in the Catskills and in Connecticut. It was much less prominent in the New Jersey colonies. Doesn't mean that it didn't exist, but it was less common. The reason being that it for the most part, certainly southern Jersey, was not a dairy farming nexus. You know, unlike some other crops, well, most crops are like it. You need an infrastructure. It's not enough that if you really want to profit for this, and it's not just for internal use, you need an infrastructure to receive the yields. And so you need packing houses or dairies or what have you, or marketing facilities in order to really, you know, to make this work. And they really didn't exist, to the best of my knowledge, in southern New Jersey. Rather, the focus was on other things. Central New Jersey, I'm sorry, did exist in lower scale than in New York and in Connecticut. Over time, however, the dairy farms, I would say dairy farming by and large was the province, wherever it happened, was the province of the multi-generational Jewish farmers. Because dairy farming, unlike, let's say, poultry or even field crops, it's a long-term investment. It's a long-term investment. It can be very risky in terms of the health of your cows over time and their yield. And so, for the most part, the dairy farms that were up and running, they were, again, these 2, 3, 4 generation Jewish farmers who began their familial journey, I would say, in the early 1900s, and not so much the waves of refugees who began arriving in these farms starting in the 1930s with the exodus, to the degree that it happened, the exodus from Nazi Germany and from hyper-nationalist Poland and fascist Romania. They, for the most part, were directed by the Jewish Agricultural Society more towards poultry growing and things that were simpler, more easily learned and more easily financed, and keep people out of debt. Dairy farming can be very debt producing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I know that one of the pages in our community contributions section does talk about a dairy farm in central New Jersey. So if you're interested, please go take a look at that entry. So most of the farms that you've been talking about in the colonies are on the East Coast and Northeast, and then there's the California chicken farmers. Was there anything happening in the middle of the country with Jewish farming?
Actually, there is, and I can't say that I have an encyclopedic knowledge of every Jewish farm that ever existed. I've been focused in my research just because it's much more easily tracked in sort of clusters, not the individual Jewish farm. But I've learned over time. Well, I'll separate these into two stages. First stage is during the Am Olam, the original utopian commune settlements. And in fact, they were mostly in the middle of the country. There was a Hebron and a Beersheba, Kansas. As I mentioned, the Palestine colony in Michigan. Sicily Island in Louisiana. There were farms in the Dakotas, Michigan, and so you had that. But for the most part, and again, we also, some of them are mentioned in the exhibit. So that would have been the first stage, and in Colorado as well. But the organized aspect of those colonies devolved very quickly, because within 5 or 6 years of the original settlement of those Am-Olam communes, they, as I said, disintegrated. From there on, so the 1890s onward, by design, the Jewish Agricultural Society and the De Hirsch Fund went about consciously settling Jewish farming colonies near, not in or next to, but near cities where there was a Jewish market or a market for their produce, and also a Jewish community through which those colonies could get Jewish services, be it religious services or social services, most easily. Because part of the failure of those initial colonies in Kansas and in Dakota and whatever was their isolation from one another and from Jewish communities. And so the story of Jewish farming, certainly in North America, is learning while you go for these settlement organizations. So by the time you reach the First World War, the colonies are really clustered in the Northeast, and Petaluma would arrive, but that's a very specific episode. But yes, there are Jewish farmers scattered all over the United States. In fact, years ago, 20 years ago, I was giving a public presentation at the biennial conference of the Reform Movement about the history of Jewish farming. And a very nice lady there came up to me and told me that she was from Texas, and that there were, in fact, a lot of Jewish farmers, heritage farmers in Texas. I begged her to send me more information, but I never received it. So there evidently was, even in Texas, for generations, there were families of Jewish farmers.
Wow, wow. Well, fascinating, fascinating. And thank you again. And I think this is the place that we're going to end. I thank you all for joining us today, taking the time out of your Sunday. If you didn't see the first presentation, the recording of that is available on the Bildner Center's website. You can go back to it. There's a link to all the recordings of all of our talks this year. Today's talk has also been recorded and will be posted later this week on our website. If you have friends who or family members who didn't have a chance to join us, they'll be able to have a chance to listen to the talk and hear more about Jewish farming. So thank you all again. Really appreciate you all coming out. Have a wonderful summer. This is the end of our programming for this summer, but I will say, please save the date for Sunday, September 18th, which is the kickoff event for next year and the Bildner Center's 25th anniversary celebration. So we hope to see you then, Sunday, September 18th. More information coming for that. And thank you again, Jonathan. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be in touch after this. And take care, everyone.